Hi everyone, this is a honey cookie set, and in this video I want to show you how an idea like this turns into a full step-by-step tutorial, carefully planned down to the smallest details. Creating tutorials like these has become a very important part of my work. So today I'd love to give you a closer look at the process behind it. Every cookie set begins long before I start working with royal icing. I usually start by planning the shapes, the overall composition, and the color palette until the whole set feels cohesive and balanced. Once the design is completely finished, I prepare the templates that later become the base for both the cookie cutters and the tutorial itself. I always try to make the process as accessible as possible, so every class includes both STL files and printable paper templates. That way, you can still recreate the set even if you don't have access to a 3D printer. In that case, you can simply cut the dough using the paper templates instead. Preparing the royal icing is a very important part of the entire process. We go through the coloring stage together, mixing shades, adjusting consistencies, and getting everything ready before we even begin decorating. I always make sure to include these steps as well, because they make the whole process much easier to understand and far less overwhelming, especially for beginners. I also like to include techniques that help make more detailed designs easier to recreate. I show how to transfer designs onto cookies using parchment templates, without needing expensive equipment like a projector. Once all the prep work is finished, we can move on to decorating. I'll be starting with the beehive cookie. For this design, I'm using two icing consistencies, a piping consistency for the outlines and a thicker medium consistency for the filling. I work on the cookie in stages, first filling sections that don't touch each other. Once those areas have had a little time to set, I move on to the adjacent sections. This medium consistency icing is fairly thick and doesn't smooth out on its own. So as I work, I help guide it with the tip of the piping bag. The tip stays in constant motion, making small side-to-side movements the entire time. This helps the thicker icing gradually level out, and by the time the section is filled, the surface looks smooth and even. Once the surface has stabilized, we can move on to the decorative details. Here I'm piping a small daisy and adding a tiny bee. For these details, I'm using a thicker piping consistency so the elements stay slightly raised and hold their shape well. A thinner consistency wouldn't work here because the details would lose their clean edges and spread too much. Shading is probably one of my favorite parts of the decorating process, because it's the stage where the cookie really starts to come to life. Even very subtle shading can add so much more depth, dimension, and character to the design. At the end, I add the final touches by painting in the stripes on the bee and adding the dashed flight path. For details like these, I prefer using a fine brush and gel food coloring instead of edible markers, because a brush gives me much better control over the thickness and softness of the lines. With the daisy, I'm working in a very similar way. First I outlined the petals and now I'm flooding them, working every other petal so the neighboring sections don't touch each other. Once they have had a little time to set, I can move on to the remaining petals. This helps the flower keep its shape and keeps the edges of the petals clean and crisp. To speed up the drying process, I also use a dehydrator between stages. I place the cookies in it for a short time so the icing can stabilize more quickly before moving on to the adjacent sections. This kind of forced drying also helps prevent cratering and keeps the surface smooth and glossy. I'll also leave a link in the video description to an article where I talk in more detail about forced drying, temperature settings, and how to dry cookies properly to help prevent the icing from cracking. I also explain how you can do this not only with a dehydrator but with a regular home oven as well. I create the center of the flower using thick icing to make it larger and more raised. Then, while the icing is still wet, I immediately sprinkle it with tiny yellow sprinkles. If you don't have this type of sprinkles, you can use colored sugar instead, or simply leave the center plain without any extra decoration. It will still look beautiful. I decorate the bee using a slightly different technique. Here, I use the same medium consistency icing for both outlining and flooding. Even though I still pipe the outline first, I don't wait for it to dry before flooding the section right away, so the outline and flood blend seamlessly together. This creates a smooth finish without a visible border between them. The medium consistency icing is thick enough to hold its shape well and works perfectly for this decorating technique. I only flood the neighboring wings after the first sections have had a little time to set. This helps keep a clean separation between the wings and prevents the icing from flowing together. I work a little differently on the bee's body. I flood the colored sections one after another without waiting for the icing to set between stages. I fill the first section and move straight to the next while the icing is still fresh. This allows the borders to blend together more naturally, creating a softer transition so the body looks more cohesive, without strong separation between the sections. I only decorate the head after the body has had a little time to set. This helps keep a clean separation between the different parts of the bee and gives the shape more definition. I apply the shading using a soft brush and very light strokes. When working with dry colors, it's important not to press too hard or rub the surface of the icing. Keep your movement soft and light so the color applies evenly. To draw the face, I first place 2 small dots to mark where the eyes will go. Then I turn those dots into 2 small curved lines to create the eyes. Below that, I add another curved line for the smile. It should sit right in the center between the eyes so the face looks balanced and symmetrical. I decorate the honey jar cookie using a more classic outline and flood technique. First, I outline the main elements and give the outline a little time to set before flooding each section. I dry each element slightly before moving on to the adjacent details so the borders stay clean and the shape of each section stays well defined. Using a fine brush and gel food coloring, I start defining some of the shapes by adding soft outlines. At the end, I also add the final details, the lettering and the small string on the lid of the jar. Little accents like these help make the design feel more polished and help separate the different elements more clearly. For this set, I added 2 heart-shaped cookies. I decided to make one of them in the main yellow palette of the set, and the other in a richer blue shade, slightly brighter than the bee's wings, to add a more noticeable accent to the overall design. Even though the base colors are different, both hearts share a very similar decorative design and the same accent colors in the details. I add all of the decorative elements only after the background icing has dried well. The last cookie in this set is a small gift tag. This design is fairly simple. First, I create a smooth background flood, let it dry completely, and then add the decorative details and the lettering. If you enjoyed this set and would like to recreate it yourself, I've left links in the video description to the STL files and printable PDF templates. The STL files can be used to make cookie cutters, and if you don't have access to a 3D printer, you can simply print the PDF templates, cut them out, and use them as guides to cut the dough by hand instead. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, and I hope this video gave you a little inspiration for your own cookie decorating projects.